When police opened the fridge, they didn't expect to find a human head, cold, clean, and placed next to a jar of pickles. The man who lived here looked ordinary, polite even. But Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a killer. He was something far more terrifying, a predator who didn't just murder, he consumed. This is not fiction. This is the real-life horror of America's most chilling cannibal. Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into darkness didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, festering transformation that began in the quiet corners of his childhood and grew into something unspeakable. From a young age, Dahmer was different. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, and polite, but emotionally distant. He wasn't violent in school. In fact, he mostly kept to himself. But behind that silent exterior, disturbing tendencies were already starting to form. By age 4, Dahmer had undergone a double hernia surgery that seemed to change him. His parents said he became more distant after that, quieter, more inward. As he grew older, his interest in death became more pronounced. While other boys were collecting baseball cards or playing sports, Dahmer was collecting roadkill. He'd roamed the woods near his Ohio home, searching for dead animals, sometimes even picking up decomposing carcasses from the side of the road. At first, he claimed it was curiosity, he wanted to see how things were put together. But soon it became more than that. He wasn't just dissecting animals. He was fascinated by the idea of controlling them even in death. The bones, in particular, brought him comfort. He said they made a sort of music when they clinked together. At school, Dahmer began to withdraw even further. His parents' marriage was collapsing in front of him. Constant arguments, emotional neglect, and his father's frequent absences left young Jeffrey to fend for himself emotionally. He started drinking, heavily and early. By his mid-teens, he was bringing liquor to school in a thermos and drinking during class. The alcohol numbed his growing obsession, the dark fantasy of controlling another person, completely. He began to have violent sexual fantasies involving domination and death. But he kept it all inside. Outwardly, he was still the quiet, awkward teen. No one suspected what was building inside his mind. Then came 1978. Dahmer was 18 and alone in his house. His parents had separated, and his mother had left with his younger brother. That's when he met Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker. They talked for a while, and Dahmer invited him back to his house for a few beers. But when Hicks tried to leave, something snapped. Dahmer didn't want him to go. He hit him in the head with a dumbbell, then strangled him. Afterwards, he dismembered the body in the basement and buried the parts in the backyard. It wasn't a carefully planned murder. It was a moment of panic. But he later said that in that act he felt something he couldn't explain, something powerful and terrible. It was the first time he felt completely in control. What's most chilling is how normal he seemed afterwards. No breakdown. No confession. He simply went on with his life. He enrolled in college, though he quickly flunked out. He joined the army but was discharged due to his drinking. Years passed, and for a while, it seemed like the violence might have been a one-time incident. But inside Dahmer, the fantasy was alive, and growing. When he moved to Milwaukee in the mid-1980s, he tried to suppress his urges. He worked at a chocolate factory and tried to maintain a routine. But the isolation and loneliness only deepened his obsession. He began visiting gay bars and bathhouses, drugging men to render them unconscious. In some cases, he lay next to them while they were unconscious for hours, just to simulate companionship and control. Eventually, he was banned from several establishments. But he kept going. The fantasies were no longer enough. He didn't want his partners to leave. He didn't want them to say no. He wanted them to stay forever. By 1987, Dahmer had given in completely. The second murder was of Stephen Twomey, whom he killed in a hotel room. He claimed he woke up next to a dead body with no memory of what had happened. But instead of calling the police, he bought a suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's house, and disposed of it piece by piece. That act marked the beginning of a killing spree that would continue for years. Each murder that followed was a repeat of the first, but with increasing cruelty, control, and ritual. He drugged his victims, strangled them, then spent hours or even days with the bodies, posing them, photographing them, and sometimes performing sexual acts on them after death. He kept bones, skulls, and organs as trophies. But at this stage he wasn't just killing for power. He was killing to fill a deep emotional void, a fear of abandonment so intense, he believed the only way to keep someone was to possess them completely, even in death. No one around him noticed. His grandmother, with whom he briefly lived, complained about strange smells and late-night activity, but Dahmer always had an excuse. Co-workers at the factory noticed he kept to himself, but nothing seemed out of place. He had learned how to mask the monster. Quiet, polite, even a little awkward, he was forgettable. And that made him even more dangerous. By the time the 1980s ended, Jeffrey Dahmer had already taken several lives. And he was just getting started. Apartment 213 didn't look like the home of a monster. On the outside, it was a modest unit in the Oxford Apartments complex in Milwaukee, nothing out of the ordinary. But once you stepped inside, the air changed. The thick smell of chemicals, decay, and something else, something unplaceable, hit anyone who entered. Most turned around quickly. But for those who didn't, the visit was their last. This was the place where Jeffrey Dahmer's fantasies evolved into something far darker than just murder. It became ritual, obsession, and a descent into depravity that even seasoned detectives struggled to understand. Dahmer's routine was disturbingly methodical. He would visit gay bars and target young men, usually men of color, often those on the fringes of society, whose disappearances wouldn't raise alarms quickly. He lured them with offers of cash in exchange for nude photos or simply a place to drink and hang out. Once inside his apartment, he would serve them a drink laced with sleeping pills or sedatives. The moment they were unconscious, he took over. Strangulation was his method of choice. Quick, quiet, and personal. But death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He would undress the bodies, photograph them in various poses, sometimes with Polaroids taken before, during, and after the killing. He kept these photos as trophies, cataloging each moment. Then came the dismemberment, carried out with cold precision. Often he would use tools in his kitchen to separate flesh from bone, storing certain parts in his fridge or freezer for later. Others he soaked in bleach to preserve or cleaned and painted to display. The cannibalism didn't start immediately. At first he only kept bones and skulls. But over time the need to possess his victims entirely grew. He began eating parts of their bodies, starting with the biceps, then the heart, the liver. He told investigators later that eating the flesh made him feel like the victim was becoming part of him, that they could never leave. In his warped mind, this was a form of eternal connection, a way to stop the abandonment that haunted him since childhood. The apartment itself became a chamber of horrors. The fridge contained human heads, neatly stored. In the freezer were hearts and internal organs wrapped in plastic. There were boxes of bones, jars filled with preserved genitals, and a 57-gallon drum in the corner where he dissolved bodies in acid. On the walls, blackout curtains blocked the light. A fish tank glowed with eerie illumination. And in the bedroom closet, skulls painted and positioned like decorations. But what was most unsettling wasn't just the gore. It was how ordinary everything seemed. Dahmer kept his space relatively clean. He was polite to neighbors. Soft-spoken. No one imagined what was happening just a few feet away. Some neighbors complained of strange odors. One woman even said it smelled like something was rotting. Dahmer told her it was spoiled meat. Once he said a freezer had broken and he was waiting to get it fixed. People believed him. Perhaps the most tragic part of this nightmare was how many close calls there were. Moments when Dahmer could have been caught and lives could have been saved. The most infamous case was that of Konorak Synthesumphone, a 14-year-old boy who escaped Dahmer's apartment in a drugged, confused state. Neighbors called the police when they saw the boy stumbling in the street, naked and bleeding. But when officers arrived, Dahmer calmly told them the boy was his adult lover, and that they'd simply had a fight. Despite neighbors protesting that the boy was clearly a minor and in distress, the officers returned him to Dahmer, right back into the killer's hands. Konorak was murdered shortly after, and his skull was later found in Dahmer's apartment. The failure of police to intervene in that moment wasn't just a tragic mistake, it was a reflection of broader systemic issues: racial bias, homophobia, and the dismissal of the marginalized. Dahmer knew how to exploit these cracks in the system. He counted on people's disbelief. On the idea that someone like him, white, quiet, unthreatening, couldn't possibly be dangerous. It worked for years. As the killings progressed, Dahmer became more emboldened. He began experimenting with what he called zombie creation. In a desperate attempt to keep his victims alive but submissive, he drilled holes in their skulls and poured acid or boiling water directly into their brains. The result was always fatal, but he kept trying. His desire wasn't just to kill, it was to own someone completely, mind and body. He wanted a partner who wouldn't leave, couldn't say no, wouldn't reject him. But in trying to make one, he only created more death. Each murder escalated in brutality. The rituals became more intense. The trophies more elaborate. He painted skulls, posed bodies, and envisioned building an altar, a shrine made of bones, candles, and black velvet, a place where he could feel powerful and safe, surrounded by his collection. This altar was never completed. But the plan revealed just how detached from reality he had become. Through it all, Dahmer kept functioning in the outside world. He worked. He shopped. He talked to neighbors. But inside apartment 213 he was building a world of horror. A secret place where his darkest fantasies were made real. And it would all continue, victim after victim, until one of them finally escaped. It all began to unravel on the night of July 22, 1991. Inside apartment 213, Jeffrey Dahmer had just brought home another intended victim, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. But this time things didn't go according to plan. Edwards noticed something off almost immediately. The strange smell, the boxes stacked in corners, the eerie blue light coming from a fish tank in the darkened living room. Then he saw the large barrel in the corner. It was all wrong. But what truly set off alarm bells was the way Dahmer looked at him. Calm, cold, and detached, as if he were already imagining him as a corpse. Dahmer handcuffed one of Edwards' wrists and threatened him with a knife, trying to lure him into the bedroom. But Edwards stayed calm, talking, stalling, pretending to go along with it. Eventually he asked to use the bathroom and saw his opportunity to escape. He bolted out the front door and ran through the streets until he found 2 police officers. Desperate and panicked, he led them back to the apartment, breathlessly explaining what had happened. The officers were skeptical. Another domestic dispute, they thought. But they followed him back anyway. When they entered the apartment, the stench hit them first. Then they noticed the Polaroids. Dozens of them, scattered in a drawer, photos of dismembered bodies in various stages of decay. The officers looked at each other. This wasn't just some fight. This was something else entirely. One officer opened the fridge. Inside, sitting on a shelf next to a box of baking soda, was a freshly severed human head. In the freezer they found more, hearts, livers, and other organs wrapped in plastic. On the floor of the bedroom, a blood-stained mattress. In the closet, painted skulls arranged with care. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't resist. When they turned to arrest him, he simply said, "For what I did, I should be dead." What followed were hours, then days, of confessions that stunned even the most experienced detectives. Dahmer told everything. Not just how he killed, but why. He spoke with eerie calmness, emotionless, almost clinical in detail. He said he didn't want his victims to leave. That the idea of being alone terrified him. Killing was never the goal, he explained. Control was. And cannibalism? That was about keeping a part of them inside him. He believed it made them a permanent part of his life. The full extent of his crimes became public, and it was more horrifying than anyone could imagine. 17 young men and boys, mostly people of color, had fallen victim to his quiet madness between 1978 and 1991. Police discovered body parts throughout the apartment, bones, severed heads, genitalia preserved in jars. The 57-gallon drum in the corner was filled with acid and the decomposing remains of multiple bodies. Some of the skulls had been painted and displayed like trophies. He had even kept the mummified scalp of one of his victims. The courtroom was packed during Dahmer's trial. The public, the media, and the families of the victims all wanted to see the man behind the monstrous acts. He was charged with 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin and later admitted to a 16th in Ohio. His defense team argued that he was mentally ill, suffering from a deep psychosis that rendered him unable to understand right from wrong. But prosecutors painted a different picture. A man who knew exactly what he was doing, methodical, careful, and deceptive. The jury agreed with the prosecution. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison. During the trial, Dahmer remained expressionless. But at sentencing he spoke directly to the victims' families. He said he was sorry. That he wished death upon himself for what he had done. Some families broke down in tears. Others screamed at him, calling him evil. One father had to be restrained after trying to charge at Dahmer in the courtroom. The pain left behind was immeasurable, and no apology could ever undo it. Prison didn't offer closure, it only raised more questions. Dahmer was kept in protective custody at first but was later moved into the general population. Surprisingly, he seemed to settle in. He found religion, was baptized in prison, and began reading the Bible regularly. Some said he had changed. Others believed he was still manipulating those around him. But that redemption, if it ever existed, didn't last long. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, while cleaning a prison bathroom. Scarver beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar. He later claimed he was told by God to kill him, that Dahmer showed no remorse and joked about his crimes. Some saw it as justice served. Others viewed it as the prison system failing yet again. Even in death, Dahmer's story continued to disturb. His actions left behind a legacy of trauma, not just for the victims' families, but for a society that couldn't understand how someone so ordinary-looking could commit such extraordinary evil. He became the subject of countless documentaries, books, and psychological studies. His name became synonymous with horror. Not because he looked like a monster, but because he didn't. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just one of murder. It's about isolation, neglect, and the terrifying places the human mind can go when left unchecked. His crimes weren't only about death. They were about control, power, and the desperate, broken need to never be alone. That's what makes his story so chilling. Not just the bodies, the bones, or the cannibalism, but the silence behind it all.